Professor Jerry. I
Morning.
can't quite go with Jerry. It seems too informal, even for this program.
Okay.
But thanks for joining us this morning. Very excited to have this conversation. Today's event was inspired by a recent ABA survey of law school graduates, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, about the impact of their debt burden and on life choices and who it's impacting. Very interesting survey. So very eager to learn more about that, and thought immediately of you because that is your practice area. You are really a nationally known person in affordability and of law school. So super excited to have you aboard. Why don't you tell us a little bit first about who you are and how you came to this topic?
So Jerry Organ, I am a Bakken Professor of Law at University of St. Thomas, where I also co-direct the Holloran Center for Ethical Leadership in the Professions with Neil Hamilton. I started focusing on trends in legal education and probably particularly financial aspects of legal education about a little bit over a decade ago. At the time, so I taught for 10 years at Missouri, and then I came to St. Thomas in 2001 when it opened. So I'm one of the founding faculty members at St. Thomas, and was involved in the admissions process pretty much the entire time I've been there. And we have had a generous scholarship program since we began. So once we opened, we gave people scholarships, and they had them all 3 years they were there. And I was just curious about how common that was or how uncommon that was. And I started to try and see what I could find out about that. And it turned out it was not actually in the 2007, 8, 9, 10 time period, it was not actually very easy to figure that out because there was no, at the time, it wasn't recorded information or published information that schools had. So it was I think I ended up with some information on about 140 schools out of 200. And of those 140, about 25% had the type of scholarship program we had that was essentially guaranteed for the 3 years. And the other 75% had some type of competitive scholarship program or conditional scholarship program where you had to maintain a certain GPA. And then 10 years ago, 2011, the ABA started requiring law schools to disclose their conditional scholarship programs and the extent to which students retained or lost scholarships if they had conditional scholarships. And so I started tracking that, and the one, from my perspective, the one kind of cool thing, I don't think I'm responsible for it. I think the downturn in applications is largely responsible for it. But as of about 3 years ago, a majority of law schools had our type of scholarship program, and the number that still had conditional scholarships had dropped to about 80 or 85. So I think that was partly disclosure, the fact that people had to tell other people what they were doing and students could find out about it. But I think in a declining applicant pool, you need to attract students, and sometimes the way to do that is to have a more competitive scholarship program by guaranteeing the scholarship. And so I think a lot of schools changed their policies. So that got me interested in it, and I've been tracking kind of cost of legal education, employment outcomes, things like that ever since.
Just because you mentioned it, the competitive or the conditional scholarship programs those have been controversial in the law school context. I don't know if in the undergraduate context those are as, I think all the scholarships I've received were also conditional, but in law school it's a different beast.
Right. No, it's a great point, Mike. I've asked a number of college students I know, or when I interact with them, and a lot of them have what we would consider conditional scholarships. The difference is college isn't graded on a curve, and law school is. And so if the typical scenario a decade ago was schools would give scholarships to 70% of their students that required them to be in the top half of the class. Well, 20% of those aren't going to be in the top half of the class. And yet schools weren't telling them that, right? They weren't explaining that some 20% of you are going to lose your scholarships. So disclosure in that area, I think, has been a big boon for law students as consumers of legal education.
I got one of those. Yeah, I've been practicing for like 13 years or whatever now. So like I went to my school because they offered me a scholarship, but you had to maintain a 3.0. And then it was like in the middle of 1L year, I'm talking to the other people who have scholarships and they're like, oh yeah, but like, did you look at the percentage of people that can actually get a 3.0 in the first year of law school? Like, oh, a lot of people are going to not have a scholarship next year. But fortunately for me, I made it. But yeah,
You were with some smart people then, if they'd figured that out. But
that was our discussion as well. We had the same discussion. I was not quite as lucky as you, Jess. My first year was not that great.
Part of the reason the article I wrote didn't just observe the phenomenon. I also think that's partly St. Thomas is widely regarded by students as being a very collaborative, supportive learning environment. And I think part of that is because people aren't competing to keep their scholarships. So I think the nature of that scholarship program actually informs or impacts the nature of the law student community and the culture you have in the law school in terms of being more competitive, more cutthroat, or more collaborative, more supportive.
I love that. That's like, oh, of course it does. Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about law school student conversations, we and I want to talk a little bit more about affordability and what it means to take on this debt. We meet with students pretty regularly throughout the year, especially at the beginning of the year during orientation and other sort of start of the year events. And I'll tell them things like, as member of the Bar Association, I don't care what your grades are. I understand that you have interest in maintaining that your highest possible GPA for job outcomes and things like that. But I don't care about that. There's always a conversation that I'm right on the edge of that I've never felt super comfortable having, and hopefully this conversation will inform that better. The ABA report said that 40% of students have a higher debt burden after graduation because of what are they called, the income-driven repayment plans. So when I'm talking to a student at the beginning of the year, I'm going to say there are a lot of you who are going to have a hard time finding a position that justifies your investment in law school, and that's part of the reason why I'm here. Because I don't care about your grades. What I care is about what you want to do, who you want to serve, that kind of thing. But I am not. I have to say, speaking on behalf of career services, certainly. Tell me a little bit about what you think that conversation ought to look like from the Bar Association to a brand new 1L.
So, I think, so I'm going to put that in a slightly different context, Mike, but I think it is comparable, right? So along with all this work I've been doing on trends in legal education, financing, employment, just enrollment trends, I've done a lot of presentations to pre-law advisors, right? And because I want people consuming legal education to be as well educated as possible, so I want pre-law advisors talking to students to be as well educated as possible. And so one of the frameworks for pre-law advisors in their conversations with students should be, what do you think you want to do with your law degree? And do you know how much that's likely to generate in terms of salary? And have you thought about how much you want to invest then if that's your likely salary, right? And the ABA does not gather salary data. And when I was involved on what was initially the ABA questionnaire committee and then became the data policy committee, I was actually not in favor of having schools collect salary data because it can be easily manipulated and it can be incomplete. But that data is available now. The National Association of Law Placement publishes annual reports on the graduating class and what their salaries are. And they generate mean and median salaries by 8 or 10 or 12 different job categories, right? Large firm, medium firm, small firm, government, judicial clerk, business. So if you have an idea, or public service, right? Judicial clerkship. So if you have an idea that I want to be a public defender, or I want to work with legal aid, there's pretty good data that NALP has that tells you starting salaries for those positions are, as of the class of, I mean, I just looked at the class of 2020 report just came out yesterday. There's actually one thing I want to highlight from that later on.
Great.
But the public service, public interest positions, the mean salary is $55,000, right? Now that's not nothing, but that's not a lot. So if you think that's what you're called to do, you think I want to be a public defender, I want to work with legal aid, does it make sense to go to the most expensive, highest ranked school possible and pay full tuition at that school where your debt load might end up being $150,000 or $200,000? And the answer is probably not. And you don't need to go to that school to get that type of position, right? Every law school is sending some people into prosecutor positions or public defender positions or public interest positions. And so, because the other piece of that, frankly, is geography, right? Where if you really wanted to go to a less expensive law school, there are state schools in a crescent from kind of North Dakota down through South Dakota, Kansas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, that are relatively affordable, right? They're not like California schools or Big Ten schools where they've charged tuition associated with more elite law schools. The challenge is, so you can find a school where tuition is relatively modest. The challenge is almost all of those schools really are effectively regional law schools. And so it's not that you can't leave those states and find a job, it's just going to be a lot harder to do that, right? And so if you're going to those law schools, you're likely to be, your most likely job possibilities or your most easily accessible job possibilities are going to be in that state or an adjoining state, right? And that's not just true of those schools, right? One of the blog postings I did in 2011, and then I did it again in 2017, is called Location, Location, Location. And it's essentially 75% of law schools, right? 3/4 of law schools, in terms of their employment footprint, are effectively regional law schools, where 2/3 or more of their graduates are employed in the state in which the law school is located or an adjacent state, right? So it's really, 25 to 30 elite law schools, and then some other odd law schools, right? Regent, for example, sends people all over the place, but that's a very distinctive school. But anyway,
That's interesting. I mean, why? Gotta ask.
Well, and so that's a long answer to your question, but I think the point is, to the extent that a student has an idea of what he or she wants to do, there is a place you can go that has pretty good data about what the expected salary is going to be. And then you should be thinking carefully about what debt load you want to take on or what investment you want to make in the legal education that provides that opportunity. And if you have, right, and this is one of the key points I make with pre-law advisors, right? If you have a chance to go to a reasonably good school with some scholarship money to defray your costs, or a more highly ranked school where you're paying full tuition, you have to think very carefully about whether the advantage of that highly ranked school justifies that additional investment, particularly if what you're wanting to do is be a public defender or a public interest lawyer where you're not going to be making significant salaries. So going back though to the point that triggered your question, on the fact that, I mean, it is one of the striking statistics in the survey, Mike. I agree. I think it's 42% of, so one caveat about the survey, it's a survey generated by the ABA Young Lawyers Division along with Access Lex Institute. And in interest of full disclosure, I'm presently executing 2 survey projects with grants from Access Lex Institute, and I did one a few years ago, so they've been supportive of my research as well. But they acknowledge that it's not necessarily a representative sample, right? They sent out emails to everybody. They had a post on their blog or on their webpage inviting people to do it. They got 1,300 some usable responses, which is a significant sample, and it is probably on the demographic information. It skews a little bit more toward women, but it is close, I think, to the race ethnicity distributions you might expect, but it's not necessarily representative. So you have to take the responses with a little caveat. So with that said, 42% of the respondents either had the same debt load, which I think was like 15%, or their debt load had actually increased, because with income-based repayment, the amount they're paid is not based on what the amortization would be on the loan. It's based on what their income is. And if their income is relatively modest, then their payments are modest, and their payments aren't meeting the interest charges on the loan, so the balance has increased. That's not great, right? To have 42% of those young lawyers, and so that's people, some have graduated in the last couple of years, some graduated 6, 7, 8 years ago,
Or 13.
Or 13. That's I'm not being critical of income-based repayment. I think that is probably a very useful tool for people coming out of law school who do not have high-paying jobs. And in theory, their salary over time is going to go up somewhat, so they should be able to get ahead of the curve a little bit at some point. But it's,
see my look of incredulity right
well,
now.
but it's not a given. No, Jess, you're right. It's not a given, and it's going to take time. And in the meantime, that's a pretty big weight on people's shoulders.
I just remember graduating and they were like, yeah, that'll be $2,000 a month. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? It's like, how would I eat or pay rent? I don't understand the math here. So some of the calculation of what your loan payment should be is like out of whack with what your earnings actually are in a given market.
Right.
And that's where graduated right before the Great Recession.
Right. So you came out at a particularly challenging time. And I might even guess some of your loans were private loans. They weren't federal loans, or were all of your loans federal loans?
Actually, all federal, thankfully.
Okay. Well, the pay as you earn and some of the income-based repayments were enacted, I want to say it was 2007 or 2008. And so, you know, the people in those programs, they're not having to pay the 2000. But
yeah, well, that's
so
me. I mean,
that's a
I'm in that
plus.
program, right?
Right, that's a
And every
plus.
year they go, hey, here's all the interest you've accumulated. You
Right.
might want to pay this so it doesn't capitalize. And you're like, okay,
Can't do it.
see if I
Right.
can cough that up. And then they don't make it easy to like apply it. Just it's like, how do I just apply it to that? It's really confusing.
Mhm.
And I'm a lawyer, so I should be able to figure it out. It shouldn't be that hard.
Well, one other related interesting thing in the survey, and I don't want to pick on you, Jess, but I think,
Go for it.
well, no, I think you might represent a subsample of people in the survey. You know, that there's a set of questions about kind of awareness of financial literacy and awareness. And I had read through the survey, again, preparing for this. And then there's actually an ABA webinar that talks through it. I don't know if you were aware of that, Mike.
No.
It's on the student, young lawyer. They have a young lawyer debt webpage that you can find it on. And so I just listened to that. And then I actually emailed one of the presenters, is a woman named Tiffany Cochran, who's at Access Lex. I've known her for several years. And they were puzzling about, I have to see if I can describe this correctly. There were two different charts they had. One that spoke to financial literacy and the fact that, you know, a number of people didn't fully understand what the consequences of borrowing would be, or maybe didn't have an appreciation that their salaries coming out of law school were not going to be $150,000. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. And so there is a reality that a number of law students might look at what they're doing with rose-colored glasses and not fully understand what the financial consequences will be of borrowing significantly. And when I talk to the pre-law advisors about these things, somebody told me, right, you have to make a decision. Do you want to live like a lawyer while you're a student and then live like a student while you're a lawyer? Or do you want to live like a student while you're a student and then live like a lawyer while you're a lawyer? And the basic point there is, you don't need to have a fancy car. You don't need to have the fancy 3-bedroom apartment. Why don't you rent something more modest, drive something more modest, borrow less, so that you have a little more financial capability at the back end? And I think some law schools, Michigan State was very good at this 5 or 6 years ago. I assume they still are. They were very good about educating students, about affirmatively encouraging students to borrow as little as possible, and to even provide education on ways students could spend less or save more, or reduce their expenses. And I think more and more schools are encouraging that. But the other chart that
I think the challenge with that, sorry to jump in here. The challenge with that is, you know, my school, I went to Morehead State, which was definitely one of the cheaper routes. It was still giving me a great undergrad. They required me to go through some financial literacy class that I didn't understand what I was going through. It was basically, look at the slides, sign off that you've looked at the slides. Good job. You're now financially literate, which, heck, I don't even know if I'm financially literate today. I try, but but going through that, even at that point in time, I had spent some time after high school. I was military straight out of high school, and then ended up going to law school or going to undergrad. Even at that point in my life, I still had that Superman complex, which we normally think of in regards to, oh, I'm not going to break my arm. Oh, I'm not going to get sick. Oh, this isn't going to happen to me. And I think that that Superman complex at that age also affects our financial literacy. And, oh, yeah, I'm taking out, $100,000. I'm going to get a nice job. I'm going to get a job that pays me $200,000 a year.
Unbridled optimism.
Yeah,
Your own future success and money-making capacity, right?
Even with that financial literacy class, that tells me what everybody else is going to have to deal with, but I'm different.
Right.
So let me just speak to that really briefly, because I actually have gotten to know Jim Leipold, the executive director of the National Association of Law Placement, pretty well over the last decade. And our introduction was actually, I don't want to say unpleasant, but he might describe it that way. We now get along really well. But 10 or 11 years ago, I sent him an email explaining why I thought their annual jobs report was creating misimpressions for prospective law students. And I don't know how many of you have paid attention to their bimodal salary chart, right? But they do collect probably 18 to 20,000 of their respondents provide salary data. And so in any given category, it's several hundred responses. So it really is the best salary data, I think, that's out there.
We used to drop that slide, that image, that bimodal curve into every online services program.
Well, and so at the time, so this is 2010, that chart showed percentage of salaries that were, at that point 120,000 or 140,000, now 190,000. And so you have whatever 38,000 graduates or 40,000 graduates. You have 20,000 people reporting salaries. You have over-reporting by people at big firms because they're happy to say I've got big salaries. And so 24% of salaries are, something like 24% of salaries were, 140,000 plus, 1 in 4. I'm optimistic, as Jess said. I'm going to be one of those people. When in fact, once you figured out that there was over-reporting of that, it should have been more like 16% of salaries, right?
Yeah.
So I actually complained and said, you need to relabel this chart so that it's not percentage of salaries, but percentage of graduates, so that they realize it's 1 in 6, not 1 in 4. And by the way, your mean salary includes this overweighting to the high end. You should have an adjusted mean that imputes salaries to everybody and says if everybody got the mean salary in their category, here's what the mean salary would be. And they've done that. To his credit, it was a slightly tense initial exchange by email and telephone conference, but to his credit, they've done that, right? And
great.
So they're trying to be better about providing that information. But Jess, you're right, right? People assume they're going to be that one going to the big firm and making the $150,000.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no incentive for an admissions person to say, okay, now have you really thought about your earning potential? And, let's talk about the numbers. They're not to, admissions people are great. I love my law school, whatever, but that's not in their interest. So there is no mechanism for an incoming student who's like pie in the sky. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to save the world and make all the money doing it. There is, I'm future Aaron Brockovich, whatever we're thinking in that moment. there is no mechanism of reality. There should be like a mandatory, like pre-law counseling that's not affiliated with admissions and sales for these
So
people going in, you know?
no, so let me make two observations. One is I think financial aid officers at universities or law schools are, even though some of them are part of that admissions team, I think they take their responsibility seriously about educating people and making them aware. And you know, I know the guy at St. Thomas who's actually part of a university financial aid, so he's not embedded with the law school, but he works very closely with our admissions office, and he's really good about talking to people and making sure they understand what's going on. But Access Lex Institute itself has made a concerted effort over the last 4 or 5 years to, I mean, they've produced a set of materials on financial literacy that was initially for law students, and then they've rolled out some for pre-law students. And Landon, it might be a little bit of your problem in the sense that, oh, here's something I have to watch, and then I check a box, and whether I'm really paying attention and really taking ownership remains to be seen. But I will say they've done their materials are really good, and they're trying, right? They're trying to make law students, pre-law students and law students more financially literate, which is not only beneficial to the law students, ultimately it's going to be beneficial to their clients, right? That they understand financial. I mean, this is one of the points I make to students early on with lots of frequency. I'm somebody who loves numbers. I don't want to claim that I'm profoundly financially literate, but I can get my way out of a paper bag. When you talk to first-year law students, a lot of them are in law school because they don't like numbers. And it's like,
Yes.
you know, law is not a respite from numbers, right? Yes, words are the cachet, but clients are going to have issues that have financial ramifications. And
Hallelujah. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here, I think, but yeah, it's not said enough.
yeah, and so anyway,
We have some really great comments and questions in the chat. I
Yeah.
want to make
Thanks,
sure
Jess.
we get some of those in here. Richard was the most recent one here, and everybody's writing like a tome. So I love this. Everybody's like fired up. Richard's asking are 6 questions. All right. Is there any research or analysis examining what the primary drivers of increasing law school tuition are? Like, why does tuition go up? Do we know? And then, you know, sort of on the back of that, are larger university systems using law school as a cash cow?
okay,
Or is it a prestige thing? Increased tuition that makes you fancier.
let me do those two. So I think law schools were using, I think universities probably were using law schools as cash cows before the Great Recession. I think law schools were revenue generators, positive revenue generators, and when the ABA did accreditation visits, one of the points of attention would frequently be how much the university was draining from the law school and how much needed to be retained by the law school so that the law school could be investing in its program of legal education and investing in its students. Following the Great Recession, there are very few law schools that are cash cows for their universities. There were 89,000 applicants to law school in 2009-10 for the 2010 class. That class was the largest entering class. I'm going to share just to give you a quick glimpse of what that looks like. That's not what I want to show. That's not the one. Hold on. Let me stop sharing and try that again. So this is what happened with applicants and matriculants between 2010 and 2015, right? It dropped from 88,000 to 54,500. Matriculants dropped from 52,000. 2010 was the peak, 52,000 down to 37,000, and it's largely stayed there. It's gone up marginally since then.
Do we have data from before this time? Because of course there was a huge influx of students to graduate school programs because of the recession too in 2008-9.
So I don't have it readily available, Jess. The law school, for most of the first decade of this millennium, law school enrollment was across all law schools was in the 45 to 46,000 first year students range. There were some new law schools that came into being. We were one of them in 2000, but then one not insignificant piece of this was for-profit law schools. Phoenix Law School, which became Arizona Summit, Florida Coastal, Charlotte, none of which are still in existence, or Florida Coastal is still in existence in a teach-out plan, right? But those are three for-profit law schools that started in the late 2000s. When they went through the accreditation process, they were looking at a size of 150 to 200 students in an entering class. As soon as they became accredited, they exploded their class size to 400 or 500 or 600. And so some of that shift from 45 to 52 or 46,000 to 52 is those three schools. They're about a third of it. By 2010, they were about 2,000 students across the three law schools. And so that's a third of that increase, right? And those are students at the lower end of the LSAT GPA distribution. So I think tuition goes up because tuition has always gone up, right? I mean, it's about on average, it's been about 3% a year. It generally goes up for universities. It is frequently going up for law schools. But the other thing I will share is that it doesn't always go up I think this is the one. Nope. Well, this one shows it. So one of the things I did with Access Lex several years ago, was a net cost analysis for incoming first-year students between 2010 and 2014. So I took a publicly available information from the ABA regarding scholarships, the number of students on scholarships, what the median scholarship was at every law school, and did estimated scholarship distributions for every student in that first-year class based on the LSAT profile of the class. And so this is a model, right? It's a formula. There are a bunch of assumptions made in it. But what it showed is that, and then this is schools by LSAT median. So I grouped schools into these 6 categories, those with a median of 165 or above, and then 5-point increments down to those with a median below 145. And between 2010, when we had peak enrollment, and 2014, which was right near the bottom, and it got a little bit worse in 15 and 16, but what you see is very elite schools were still able to grow their tuition, and non-elite schools were able to grow their tuition. But in the middle, and particularly, I mean the middle, 150 to 154, 155 to 159, net tuition actually went down. right? So what you need to grasp there is tuition's going up by 3% every year, but there is so much more scholarship money going out in 12, 13, 14 in order to attract students because the applicant pool has dropped so much that in fact, on average, students are paying less for law school, $4,000 less for law school than they had been in 2010. And so law school's gotten more expensive, right? On the sticker price tuition. But in fact, when you look a little deeper, for a whole bunch of law schools and students at those law schools across the first part of this past decade, really into 2016, 2017, law school got less expensive, right? It actually was probably the best time to go to law school in the last 20 years in terms of those scholarship discounts, with the exceptions being, and this feeds into part of the conversation that the debt report speaks to, with the exception being the top law schools, and there, right, is it a reasonable investment to spend $33,000 a year on tuition when the average salary of those graduates is $120,000 or $130,000? Probably, right?
Yeah.
But now,
Well, you
now
you
go
got
to
the
the
Harvards, and then you
right.
got
If you're
the
Harvard,
poor
Columbia, on
students
the
that are paying through the nose to go to the
right.
privately for-profit schools.
So right. So when you look at this little smiley face divide, right? People at the top paying $33,000, they're buying a reasonable investment, right? Because their employment outcomes are really strong. People at the bottom, the schools with a median LSAT of 140, of less than 145, they're paying the same $33,000 a year because those schools aren't offering very many scholarships. And yet the employment outcomes at those schools are a far cry from what you see at the elite schools. And so there, I'm not sure that investment is as worthwhile. But part of the point I wanted to make in response to that question is that this last decade for law schools has been a real challenge financially, particularly for schools in that middle range.
Well, and the second part of Richard's question is sort of like, it doesn't, from an outside perspective, look like the overhead for law school is that much, right? It's like a bunch of people just lecturing you in a library. Why is law school so expensive? And are we looking at institutionally, like, why does it cost so much? And, I think part of that is obviously, as a lawyer for nonprofits, like your personnel is a huge line item for any law school, right? And so if everybody's going to get even a cost of living increase, let alone a performance-based increase, your personnel goes up every year. Your Westlaw costs go up every year. You've got a building that needs maintenance, that needs repair. I get that, but it does seem like law school is much more expensive than other types of schools. So
You're not
what
dealing
gives?
with it. I think the undergraduate problem of, dealing with students who are away from home for the first time. So your food plan needs to be awesome, and the dormitories need to be excellent.
Right. So Jess, the major cost at law schools is personnel, right? It is faculty, staff, and to some extent, I mean, the ABA section of legal education admissions to the bars has been looking at some of these questions over the last decade. The accreditation standards at some level drive the expense because the accreditation standards required certain things, right? So, for example, classes had to be X number of minutes per credit, and first year classes had to be taught predominantly by full-time faculty, and a certain percentage of all courses need to be taught by full-time faculty, right? Those things frame where certain amounts of money have to be spent. The pandemic So there was some movement toward hybrid forms of education. Mitchell Hamlin was one of the first schools to get a variance for hybrid, and Syracuse now has that. The pandemic has accelerated questions about alternative delivery models, right? And whether everything has to be in person and has to be full-time faculty. And I don't know how the ABA is actually going to come out on all that. But I can say there is increased attention to maybe modifying some of the accreditation standards to allow schools interested in exploring lower cost models to figure out if they can do that. Whether that will happen, I don't know. But you know, a lot of the cost is people, right? And it is rankings or prestige, in the sense that prestigious law schools want prestigious scholars, and they compete for them, and they pay
Sure.
top salary, and then
Supply and demand.
right, supply and demand, and then other people have to pay high salaries to try and keep people, or right. And so it is
Is part of it the lower volume of the student body of a law school relative to the cost? Like is the cost per student higher for a law school because you have a smaller number of people versus an undergraduate program where you've got like a lecture room with 400 people, and you kind of can spread that. The cost allocation plan per student in the undergraduate programs is maybe a little bit more dispersed, or am I not thinking
no,
about
I
that
think
right?
you're probably right, Jess. The other piece of this is, right, law schools have, partly at the direction of the profession and the ABA, they have generated more opportunities for experiential learning, particularly clinics. And those learning experiences are lower ratio experiences, right? First year classes, you can have 80 people in a room with one professor, or 120 people in a room with one professor. A clinic has to be 8-to-1 or 10-to-1 or 12-to-1, probably at the most. And so to the extent that law schools have responded to demands from the legal profession and from the ABA to provide more practical training, not just theoretical, think like a lawyer training, the one reality of that is that most of those models are slightly more expensive because of the lower student faculty ratio.
Yeah. And I mean, I know a bunch of people in academia because I'm a nerd, and I know like universities are, you know, actively trying to lower their costs by having less faculty tenured staff
Right.
and using adjuncts, and I'm sure that's true in law schools as well. I mean, just thinking when I was
Right.
in school, my practical clinic type classes were all adjunct people, and I had several adjunct professors as well, so that makes sense.
So do you have other questions?
From
There was a
the,
bunch of good stuff in the chat, more comments, people sharing their experience.
So a couple of things I wanted to highlight. I really enjoyed this conversation, but I realized you only have like, it's like, wow, the hour's almost gone. So one of the other noteworthy things, so one was the fact that 42% of people owe as much or more on their loans as they did when they graduated. One of the, and then just, you know, we talked a little bit about financial awareness and lack of financial awareness. So Mike, one thing I wanted to say is, you had asked me a question about what can the MSBA do. I think that would be one place where I think if the MSBA could look at some of the Access Lex materials and then think about how they can do some programming that complements that for new graduates, or even for law students, on financial literacy and financial awareness and understanding things, so that because I think that's an area where things could improve. I did talk to Tiffany. I emailed her when I went through the report and watched their webinar, and I'm going to be talking to her tomorrow. I think there might be, so I talked about those two charts. One was, you know, things people didn't understand about salaries or loans or whatever. And one other chart was satisfaction, and more recent graduates are happier about their decision to go to law school and more likely to do it again than graduates from a few years ago and then graduates from several years ago. So the further back you are in terms of when you graduated, the less satisfied you are. And that puzzled Tiffany and the ABA people on the webinar. And I have a theory for that I'll find out more when I talk with Tiffany. I think part of that is, and again, just going to you as a example, right? For the people who went to law school when you did, or in the midst of the Great Recession, there wasn't good information about employment outcomes. There wasn't good information about scholarships. There wasn't a lot of information to make you better consumers. The ABA has done a lot on getting better consumer information out there. And so I think it's possible that the more recent graduates are more satisfied because they had better information. They knew what they were getting. They knew a little bit more about what they were getting into. And so they're not as surprised to find out, oh, this is what I'm making. And now the other piece of that is the employment market over the last few years has improved significantly. So I don't know that it's just the better consumer information. I think it's combined with a better employment market. But I do think some of those earlier graduates, 2010, 11, 12, 13, they didn't have the benefit of consumer information that the ABA has gotten much better about sharing. And I think that it was a problem, right? And they were a little bit whipsawed by the reality they entered not being what they had expected.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of, as with any statistic out there, I think it's really questioning if that survey is done for everybody at their, for example, third year out of law school. You know, is that consistently that everybody's happy, and then once they get to 10 years, they start decreasing in happiness? The other thing would be, if we're looking back earlier, even to the 2000s or the 90s, how those people feel. Did they have dissatisfaction because that information wasn't out there then, although cost has increased?
Right. So I'll address that really quickly. Right. I did an article about a decade ago on satisfaction and looked at every at least reasonably sociologically valid survey of lawyers or alumni from law schools. There were different types of surveys. I covered about a 3-decade period. It was roughly 28 or 32 surveys. And across that, 80% of it was a pretty even bell curve distribution with a average satisfaction level about 80%. But in general, once you disaggregate a little bit, the more experience you had as a lawyer, the more satisfied you were. And so the least satisfied in general were the more recent graduates. And so that's why this data from this debt survey is intriguing. Because it's
I was going to say, how do you know it's just not us being more jaded as we get older?
So when I looked through some of the survey stuff, right, there was one survey of Yale graduates, and they're obviously a unique bunch, but what it showed is that every job change resulted in greater satisfaction. And if you just tease through that a little bit, right, that should make sense, right? I should only be changing the job if it's to a type of job I'm going to enjoy better, or it's going to be a better salary, or both, right? There should be positive factors. And the other thing those surveys don't do, so this would be the caveat, the other thing those surveys generally don't do is they don't pick up the people who've left the practice, right? And so that more senior group, that more experienced group, is the people who stayed. They likely are more satisfied because they stayed. We're not hearing from
error. Yeah.
Right. We're not hearing from the people who've left. You know, I don't mean to suggest it's all roses and sunshine. But I do think the longer you're in practice, the more you figure out the practice area you're interested in, you gain more confidence because you've really learned it well. And so you are more capable, and you've developed relationships, or you understand work environments that that are going to be satisfying for you, right? And again, I realize there's some comments suggesting that may not be entirely true, but the data, up until a decade ago was pretty clear. But the other piece of this that I think is challenging is the mental health side, right?
Yes.
65% of respondents felt anxious or stressed. 44% depressed or hopeless. This is, I think, the question was something like, in the last month, have you felt? 41% felt inadequate, 41% were embarrassed or ashamed. And that was, they did a little bit of disaggregation in relation to debt level. And the larger the debt level was, the greater these experiences of anxiety, hopelessness, inadequacy, or shame. So there is a correlation between kind of mental health, well-being, and debt. That's not positive, right? The greater the debt is, the less the well-being is. And this isn't going to get better. So let me just highlight, if I can do one more screen share. I know our time's almost up.
Keep going. I'm interested.
We're
recording.
I'm one of the co-investigators on the survey of law student well-being that came out that we did in 2014. We did another one this spring. So this had 39 law schools participating. We've had over 5,000 respondents. And this is what I wanted to highlight. Depression or anxiety diagnosis. So this question is, have you been diagnosed for a variety of mental health issues in your lifetime? And then there was a question about, had that diagnosis occurred since starting law school? But the key thing I want to highlight here is, in 2014, 21% of respondents. That year we had 15 law schools participating and roughly 3,000 respondents. 21% had a diagnosis. Now it's 40%. In 2014, 18% had a diagnosis of depression. Now it's 33%. So, and that's not just, right? COVID might have exacerbated that a little bit, but it's not just COVID, right? The population coming through colleges tends to have higher rates of mental health issues, and those are now becoming law students. And
and one thing I'm wondering if it's been looked at is, of course, since 2014, I mean, COVID, obviously 2021, I think there's a lot more stress. You've already addressed that. But the other aspect is, since 2014, I would like to think we've taken a lot more advancement in being able to recognize, admit, embrace the fact that mental health is a thing. It's not something that we necessarily hide. I think 2014 was better than 2004, and probably, hopefully, better than 94. But we're taking those steps going forward. And so I'm wondering how much you think that might skew the statistics.
So, no, I think, we have not hit, this is a first layer of data. We have a lot more analysis to do that's going to involve some disaggregation and some other pieces of this. And one of the factors for not seeking help, right? So we also had some questions about help-seeking behavior. And the encouraging thing is that a smaller percentage of respondents this time believe keeping problems hidden will help their admission to the bar with respect to mental health issues. With respect to alcohol, drug, that we didn't see any progress on that question, but on mental health we did. And so there's a subset of questions on factors, and I'm going to be intrigued by stigma, right? And whether there's a kind of a recognition that stigma has declined, because I think it is. Think of all of the celebrities and athletes, particularly in the last year, who have been acknowledging mental health issues in ways that normalize it for people. So I think that is encouraging, and that may be part of what's going on. But I think we just have more issues in our college student population who are becoming law students, who then are going to be becoming lawyers. And the issue, you know, I have to say the Board of Law Examiners here in Minnesota has been awesome in working with the law schools. They come during orientation and they're very explicit about signaling the importance of getting the help you need, and that if you get the help you need, you're unlikely to have any issue getting admitted to the bar because you're managing your challenges appropriately. And so I really want to give props to the Board of Law Examiners, because we started talking to them after this data came out in 2016. The 2014 data came out in 2016, and they've been very responsive and very, I think, very on message in terms of what they're talking to first-year students about, and second and third-year students, but particularly first-year students.
That's fantastic. I hate to cut us off at this time. I will give folks one last chance just to chat in a question now that we've got Jerry with us.
I'd be happy to come back, Mike. This was fun.
Yeah, this is great. We'll definitely have you back, at least for a meeting. I'm inspired to work with the new lawyers group now on some new programming. It's I've got lots of fresh ideas, so thank you for that. It's been really great. Jess, Landon, do you have any final questions before I turn
No,
this
just
off?
thanks for being here and bringing all of that insight, because I think this, you know, as the comments in the chat show, I mean, this is something that's important to the community, and it's a toughie.
I did realize one other point I want to make, if you don't mind, Mike.
Go for it.
So this is prompted partly by the NALP report from yesterday on the class of 2020. For the first time, they did an analysis based on socioeconomics of the graduates, and graduates who are first generation. And their data show that first generation graduates of law school have less robust employment outcomes than non-first generation graduates. So students coming from, and there's an intersectionality then between first generation law students and law students of color. And so law students of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanic Americans or Latinx, have tended, and to some extent Native American and Pacific Islander. Asian Americans tend to do fairly well, comparable to whites, but the other graduates of color tend to have less robust employment outcomes. And that means, and frequently that's associated with more debt, right? Because when you look at that distribution, those schools on my net tuition chart, those schools that had the median LSAT below 145, those are disproportionately populated by students of color, because they historically have tended not to perform as well on the LSAT, and so they can't get into certain other schools. And those are schools with less robust employment outcomes. So they're paying a fair amount for their education because they're not getting scholarships, and their employment outcomes aren't as robust. And so that's going to become, right? And this debt study showed that, you know, the people who were most likely to have the same or more debt than they had at graduation were graduates of color, right? So there is an inequity in how the financing of legal education is functioning right now, and it's a challenge for first generation and for students of color who we want to have in the profession, right? We want to diversify the profession, but it's almost like systemically we make it harder for them.
It's not
So-
almost like, it is like.
It definitely is. Well, and I think part two of this conversation, if prompt that, this all feels very personal right now. And for that reason, it's interesting. But I think just, systemically, professionally, what are the impacts for rural communities, for minority communities, for, who's getting served by this system? If it's not affordable, we have a whole long other additional conversation, I think, on that side of things to have as well. So maybe you'll come back.
Just invite me.
You bet. Also, Jess, Landon, again, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much.